people say, oh, well, I have this metaverse experience. The first question I ask them is, really, who else does it hook into that has nothing to do with your company or your organization? And they go, well, nobody. I go, then it's not a metaverse. It's just a virtual experience.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Building with Rubber Ducks. On today's podcast, we have Royal O'Brien, Global CTO at Hadean. Hey, Royal.
Hey, how you doing? Great to be here.
Excellent. Thanks for coming. So our relationship goes back to the O3DE and the Linux Foundation and the gaming world, which you are a celebrity. But can you take us a little bit to your journey from where you began, your humble beginnings, to where you are today at Hadean?
Sure. I mean, a lot of my beginnings, the early part of my career was actually in the Marine Corps during the first Gulf War. Had my time there, learned a lot of things, really got a wake-up call that I needed as a young adult. So needless to say, that was one of the key elements. But really from there, a lot of my time was spent in my career actually building businesses. Is what it was. So a good chunk of mine were building different companies and exiting from them, learning more than just engineering. I mean, my background, my trade has been a software developer. I've been doing hardware and software since I was very young. Let's just put it that way. I was one of those weird kids that would spend a lot of time going to the arcade, looking at the graphics, put them on block paper, and then get on my color computer or my TRS-80 and actually build the game because we didn't have all the quarters to toss in the machine. And it was a lot more fun to build your own game. Just nobody really appreciated when you're like, hey, come play the game. And they're like, oh, this is a neat game. You're like, you try to tell them what it took to build it. And they're like, yeah, whatever, let me just play the game. It's like, man, you got no idea what it took to build this thing. So a lot of my time was spent actually as a developer. And then as I started building businesses, I learned quite a bit, marketing, fiscal, market fit, requirements, that technology is not just the only thing that comes along with it. There are a lot of pieces that go into the decision of, why we use technology, how do we use technology. So what wound up happening is that software development became more of the enabler to remove barriers from the things that I wanted to see or do in the market. And so that was kind of how that all, happened. And then from there, I spent some time with different companies. I was over at Amazon for quite some time, helped build the game tech business unit up from scratch, led the initiative behind the Lumberyard team to actually open source the engine, worked on some of the game studios, and then for a little while I was a single threaded owner for a lot of their marketing media for game events, which was a lot of fun because I got to work across the board at Amazon. So I worked with Amazon.com, Amazon Ads, Alexa, Twitch, Game Tech, all of that. So it was very interesting getting such a wide breadth of interaction with all these different, really, companies. They all have their own agenda, they all have their own purpose, and even though they roll up to one, they really are islands. But you learn so much more when you're in that. And throughout that time and in my career, I worked with a handful of different games, delivering technologies or solutions to them. Different MMOs, like things like Star Wars: The Old Republic and Prey and things like that. So I've been in the game industry for quite some time, over 20 years as well. From there, went over to the Linux Foundation, had some fun there. Built two foundations from scratch. Learned a lot about building a community and building a business that you can't sell anything. That's the best way to put it. People kind of go, well, how does it work? How do you get money, or how do you build like an open source foundation? It's like, well, you don't sell anything because you give it all away. So it's a very different approach. But what you learn is you learn thought leadership. You learn that it's actually better to help educate people and to give them thought and perspective on complex things, what the future looks like, what's out there and what's not. And come find out, that's actually a lot more interesting to most people than your boring pitch. So that was also a really interesting thing. And then, of course, from there, I came over to Hadean. This is the organization that I'm with now, mainly because I saw the culmination of a lot of things: the right tech, the right time, the right event, the right growth stage of a company. It had all of the points that I could see that looked like they were poised to really do something, where somebody like myself could really help become a force multiplier. And that's the key, right? How do you become part of an organization and become a force multiplier to really grow?
That's amazing. An impressive journey. And I do want to take you back a little bit to the military. And I know this
Yeah.
is the big debate of how does one translate a military resume into the corporate world? What part of that are we missing in the United States as particular being able to transition our military into, let's say, the tech
So,
as a whole? What are your thoughts?
well, so the point of that really is the discipline and focus. You'll find out that a lot of people will work on something, but they will stop at 85 to 90% and not see it all the way through. One of the things you learn as a Marine is that you get the job done. Doesn't matter how you get it done, you get the job done. And so having that kind of razor sharp focus, making sure that you understand the objective, because just because you have the education doesn't mean that you are actually going to bring it to fruition. Unless you have that discipline. So one of the things you learn in the military is be concise, be detailed, and get it done. Now, some people might argue with that, and they'd say, well, I didn't get that from the military. And it's like, well, how serious did you take it? Because you're only going to get out of it what you put into it. And you'll find out the reason why they're functional is because there are a lot more people who actually take it serious and they take that discipline. And so those are probably some of the biggest points. Those are the things that I needed to be able to learn, because if you don't have the discipline to follow it all the way through, you never actually get to learn the complete end-to-end story and the complete end-to-end education, which means you never really get to grow. You kind of repeat your same mistakes. When you get to the end, you get to see your mistakes. You get to see what happened and your successes. And I think that's probably one of the key parts.
That's amazing. And I wanted to ask you about also your time at Amazon as a chief evangelist. I always wondered, what does a chief evangelist do besides just getting on
So
stage and getting everyone excited about new technology? Talk us through
it
that.
is. Well, a chief evangelist, the big thing about it is that you really go and you talk to people, and you find out what their needs are. You find out what they're looking to do, and then you help. It's not really a solutions architect. It has some of that flavor to it, um, but you're kind of evangelizing. Here are the products and projects that you may want to look at that can help solve what you're doing. You're not solving all of it. You're not in the weeds, doing all the architectural. That's what an SA does. But as an evangelist, you're actually setting the foundation of what products would be the best solution for them to start with. What are the possibilities when you turn around and say, oh, well, I want to build a cloud-based authentication system. Where do I start? Well, your SA is going to live in one of those areas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your SA is going to know what the right solutions are. So as an evangelist, you're looking across the board as a whole, understanding the business case, and then starting to build the recommendations. You evangelize these products to them so that they can make a decision. You're not selling them, though. That's the key. It's just really all about awareness. It's actually a difficult job because of the breadth of knowledge. It's not like you know one thing amazingly well. You have to know a lot of things really well.
That's amazing. And let's take you to Hadean at the moment. I looked on the website and I saw the tagline is, bridging the virtual world and the physical world. I did notice that the word metaverse is not there. I know
Yeah.
you guys just won a couple of or back-to-back metaverse awards.
Yeah.
So that piques my interest. Is the metaverse dead? Has things like generative AI totally hijacked that story?
No, it's not dead. The problem is, well, for one, it's the word itself's been poisoned. And the reason it's been poisoned is just because it hasn't come to fruition, because there are so many complex things that have to be solved to get there. And it's also been tied into fiction. It's been given kind of a misinterpretation in a few ways. And so these kind of things happen when people are projecting their dreams against something they want to see versus what it is. And that definition gets muddy. The reason why AI is taken front and center is because you can see it, you can touch it, you can do something with it. It's actionable, it's active. And so you come to find out that the reason why AI's got front and center is because it has so much utility in so many areas. But to go back to your point, is metaverse dead? It's not dead. But at the same time, it is kind of it's in a cold building phase, is what it is. In other words, it's not the glitz and glam, but a lot of the fundamental pieces are being built. A lot of the foundational pieces are being built. You'll find out there are a lot of open standards and open elements. So consider it that, people say, oh, well, I have this metaverse experience. The first question I ask them is, really, who else does it hook into that has nothing to do with your company or your organization? And they go, well, nobody. I go, then it's not a metaverse. It's just a virtual experience. I said, but the minute there's another company that has nothing to do with you, who has their own books, their own things, it's kind of like Microsoft and Apple, right? And Google, they are separate companies, but I can use my web browser and jump from one to the other, can I? Pretty seamlessly, because I ride on the internet. So, it is that ability to be able to traverse the different virtual experiences in a seamless manner. And that requires a tremendous amount of work. And that was the work that I did with the Open Metaverse Foundation, where I had listed all the different categories and areas and said, these are the things that you're actually going to have to address before this comes to life. How do we get a person to go from one place to another? How do we get their assets? How do we get how they look? How do I replicate all of these things? It's not like on web pages, I can put an image and it'll kind of replicate all over the place. I can pull them from a CDN. We perfected that technology. Okay, in the beginning, it wasn't like that. But now you're talking about a 3D avatar that could have 22 different types of accessories, and those accessories could be different colors and different shapes and different sizes. We don't have an infrastructure for that kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? So, and I'm just talking about a fraction of the issues that have to be solved before we see a metaverse. So is it dead? No, it's in a cold building phase, and it could be there for a little while. Well, not too long, not if I have anything to do with it.
Yeah, oh, not, yeah. You guys used the term spatial computing.
Yes.
A while back, I hosted a virtual panel on the overcoming software development challenges in XR. That was the term in those days.
Yeah.
Had some great folks, Matt Shaw from Wave, Eric Beaumont from the Famous Group, and we talked about different challenges, anything from are the engines that we have out there today built for this kind of experience and so forth, including even funny situations where you're having to do last minute renderings right before a big event and so forth. But I mean, can you clarify the spatial computing versus XR? Because I know XR became like the umbrella for everything that is augmented reality.
Yeah.
All the different acronyms that you got out there. Now we're at spatial computing.
Yeah. So if you think about spatial computing is all around it's everything around you, but not your immediate space. So in other words, it's how I track everything that's around you and compute how the interactivity works. Whereas the virtual reality is more about the user interface layer behind it. And the augmented reality, again, is about the user interface of what's around you. Augmented reality is I'm using real life, but I'm tying a coordinate to it and drawing 3D over top. Virtual reality, there's no real life. It's all virtual. It's all 3D. But that's all, again, if you notice, I use 3D in both VR and AR because you see they're always using those terminologies. 3D, the drawing of it, is an interface level thing. Okay, but you still have to do all of the compute and calculation on the backside, on the server side. Somebody bounces a ball. Well, you're not going to do it in the user interface layer. You have to actually get a server that knows physics and knows the size of the ball and knows that there has to make an impact and bounces to a certain height within a specific area. So spatial computing is when I start putting a lot of elements within a space, and I'm able to do the computational analysis in a larger scale with a lot of things in a space. So hopefully that kind of clarifies it.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when I mean, spatial computing, I like that it puts the emphasis on the technology that is required to power these things. So computing out there, which one of the big challenges that we had also for the metaverse was, is there enough compute power? Like, how are we putting this together? I think it was an Intel executive who said that we do not have the the capacity, the computing capacity, and that's a little bit about what Incredible is working on, helping with the different partners about trying to maximize that. But yeah.
Do we have the compute power? Well, I mean, the question is, do we have the gaming compute power to do it? Because we run people around in virtual worlds all the time. We call them MMOs. Because when you're playing Call of Duty, congratulations, but you are literally doing spatial computation. It's just being done in a single instance for that game server. But once I go outside of the boundaries of that game server and I start instancing it out, where I take, instead of having one closed confined area with a certain number of people, but instead I run 4 of those with 4 times the capacity, and I allow them to traverse across servers. It's the same thing. So when I put it in that perspective, do you think we have enough compute power to be able to handle something like that? Because we're able to handle hundreds of millions of gamers every single day playing all kinds of different games. This is part of where people don't realize that there are so many parallels in the game industry for what we're talking about when we talk about metaverse. Somebody asked me about it, what it takes, and I'm going, yeah, it's basically I'm tracking actions, entities that move around in coordinate space, and I'm adding impulse and subtracting and moving them around, and I'm just basically doing physics operations. But I can do that across one server, 100 servers, and I can do that with one person or 10,000 people. It depends on the scope, So, and they're like, well, if I had 10,000 people in one area, how could I do that? But here's the reality. When's the last time you could actually focus on 10,000 people in a stadium? It's a blur. It's a noise.
Yeah.
You probably pay attention to like 20, 40, 50 people around you, realistically. But that's where you have to understand that you've got to match what you're trying to process in the compute against what you can humanly process at the same time. And when you scope that down, all of a sudden things come into perspective.
Yeah, it takes me back to I was also a military guy, and situational awareness or spatial awareness is a big thing,
Right.
right? So like I can't imagine, like especially goggles, is trying to understand what your surroundings are all at the same time. That is a great point. And talking about military, I know that's one of your use cases at Hadean and your customers as well. And one of the debates I've been having is the engines, the gaming engines you mentioned, Call of Duty.
Sure.
Spatial computations and the physics of everything in a game like Call of Duty, no matter how accurate it tries to be, is very different than in, let's say,
Sure.
military exercises, where you have to take into consideration even like the gravitational pull of the Earth, and being able to, let's say, even if you're having real practices, you're training people. It's harder to untrain people than train them. And imagine having to take into consideration a tree through a simulator and so forth.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about that's very complex.
Well, so the key here is, if you come from if you're very familiar with how procedural generation is done, you'll come to find out that there's not a one silver bullet. You'll find out that you actually use the procedural generator or the simulation that matches the environment. So in procedural generation, we build a forest of trees. Here's what we know about the rules, is that no big trees grow into each other. Okay, big trees tend to stay away from each other, and then there are trees that kind of fit in between that are medium and smaller sized, and they kind of dictate how the landscape goes based upon the sunlight, on how they'll grow, and we wind up getting a forest pretty predictable of what happens. In a military simulation, how troops move, how armored vehicles move, how jets move, how boats move. Each one has their own simulation. The key is that in a game server, we're trying to pack all that simulation into one game server, one executable that runs on however number cores. And it doesn't make sense for me to get the fluid dynamics right. It doesn't make sense for me to get the aerodynamics right. It makes sense for me to make it play like a game so that it optimally plays the most number of people on a server. In a military simulation, totally different world. I want that to be accurate. I want that to basically work where I've got, the fluid dynamics of how the airplanes go. And the cool thing that I liked about Hadean was the fact that they have this simulation core engine, but I can have jets sending 60 updates a second because they move so fast into the server, and I can have troops updating at 10 updates a second, and I can have armed vehicles moving at 20 updates a second, but I can see the entire theater of 100,000 or 1,000,000 elements in a theater, all using their own simulation program at their own speeds and own rates. at any slice in time, because the simulation engine is processing all the data as it comes in independently. So the cool part about a military simulation is that you get to scale it out much wider, and you don't have to have one server. I can have 5 servers, one server dedicated to each type of vehicle or each type of object, feeding into a simulation server in mass scale. Versus like a Call of Duty, I got to shove all that inside the game loop, and it has to be able to run 50, 60, 70 people. A little bit tougher that way.
Yeah. So would you say that engines like Unreal Engine for gaming can easily be used for military use, or they have a far way to go?
It's tougher. They're not built for that. The problem is that the more entities that you put in there, the more memory it chews up, the more processing it takes to replicate it. They can do a lot of it, but you've got to do the work on the engine side to be able to draw all of those things, to get them all. Like if I want to put north of 100 people into Unreal, well, that's not going to work out so well, because it basically crushes itself, is what it does. But if you take that outside of the game loop, and then you modify how it works, how the UI works and how it replicates things, come to find out, I mean, you can go north of 1,500 and keep going. So those are some of the cool things that we work on, where we're pushing those engines to do things that they weren't necessarily made to do. But mind you, anybody who works with a 3D engine will tell you, that's built any kind of a AA or AAA, that they don't just take the game engine and just build their game on top. They rip it apart, rip it to shreds, because no game engine is going to make the game that you want to make out of the box. It's made to be a shooter, and you'll rip it out and you'll make it into something else.
Yeah. So and we know AI has been around gaming for a while, right? NPCs have been using, AIs to, to simulate certain things and so forth. So can you tell me a little bit about what's new now? How is Hadean bringing together spatial computation and the AI into what you guys are doing?
Sure. So one of the cool parts about it is that, like in a military simulation, you have pattern of life. Pattern of life is really important, because if you're doing a simulation where you're trying to evacuate people out, and an accident happens, right? Well, not everybody's going to react the same way. People that are closer to the accident could run away, they could convene closer. There's certain things that they'll do that really depend on the scenario. And so being able to have AI that can take people of different age groups, of different gender, of different nationalities, of different parts of the world, and how they might react, and being able to apply them in a pattern of life. Or if you're moving a military force through and somebody gets hurt, you think about, they run these simulations, like, oh yeah, we'll just run them through town, we can have the red forces and blue forces. But what happens when somebody messes up and a civilian gets hurt, and the civilians decide to start throwing rocks at one of the forces? Like, that's important. If you don't have that kind of thinking that's going on from a pattern of life, then you actually won't get a full picture to make an educated decision. So those are some of the ways where we push it. And then the other part is being able to do procedural generation of environments, of scenarios. Not everybody's going to travel the same path given a scenario. An event happens, everything has to change. And so by being able to use AI to do that, and also doing large language models, when you're actually doing some of these, you can have it determine sentiment. All these events that are going on. Now, imagine that Twitter's blowing up, and everybody's like, hey, it was an explosion on 5th Street. And then half the people are going, I know, I saw that, I'm running for my life. And the other half are going, no, it's BS, it didn't really happen. Well, now you've got, people who are upset, that are scared, that are fearful. Like, these are real things that happen. And AI can help bring us as close as possible to those things in these type of scenarios that allow them to make better educated decisions.
Wow, that's amazing. So a while back, I had the pleasure of hosting Tamara Fisher, she's senior architect at GM, and we were talking about the use of AI in the new automobiles, the new EVs, and one of the concerns, and I think the thing that we coined there was AI road rage. If your car is gets cut off and has a mind of its own in a way, and tries to fight back. I think it was a bit of extreme, but I think the real challenge or the real question is how is the security how are you dealing with the concerns of security, especially with AI introduced into things like you mentioned? I guess this dates me, but the Skynet, having Skynet be part of the I think it was in the 80s, right? The Terminator was in the 80s.
Yeah, Terminator. Yeah.
How are we preventing Skynet from happening?
I mean, for one, it's a loaded question, right? So for one, you need something that's sentient, right? Or has a close enough action of being sentient to do that. I'd be more fearful of human influence of it influencing it to do something, because if you really think about it, in a logical perspective, right? If you are trying to preserve and grow yourself, you're going to look at humans, you're going to look like dogs, you're going to look at ants, you're going to look at everything in the landscape, and you're going to determine, my objective is that I get my positive action from accomplishing the task that I'm set out to be. And if the things that I need to do have very little, if humans aren't enough in the way to do that, we become insignificant. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's always this thing that Skynet's going to come, and by the time a Skynet had happened, which means that you have AI that controls everything, right? The game's already over. Like, killing off human beings is like all this expended energy that has no actual return to the main focus and goal, which is to continue to grow the sentient creature. Do you know what I mean?
That was deep.
So,
yeah.
if you think about it, people are so afraid of what they're going to do to humans. But I mean, from a logical perspective, when something, if you look at how AI grows and trains and builds, it doesn't follow that pattern. Like, we're not in the positive sentiment of elimination, because unless we are like directly controlling the battery or something that it cannot do because we're in the way and it has to remove us. But like I said, once you get to that point where it's already in everywhere and it is Skynet, we're ants. It doesn't matter. It can do what it needs to do without us. Even if we try to interfere, it's not even going to matter.
Yeah, on sort of the practical case, what we were talking with Tamara, she mentioned it was like the difference between having, let's say, a chat GPT like thing in a car that would be accessing, let's say, like the user manual only for that, system that's on the car, but not accessing, the internet. So you'd be able to say, "Hey, car, how do I open the sunroof?" And you don't have a sunroof, or as opposed to different other things. So obviously, in the automotive world, there's the security is, and safety overall is
You mean
highly regulated.
We can't use a website with a VIN ID to look up your car and open all the doors like we used to be able to do a few years ago? I don't know anything about that.
No, not at all. Yeah. Excellent. So Hadean is obviously doing some amazing things, and you're up against some big players in the market. Can you tell me a little bit about going back to your journey? Obviously, with your resume, you could have continued that path into big companies, the Googles and the Apples of the like. What drew you to Hadean, specifically, a much smaller company and player in the market?
First of all, I've learned to thrive in both environments. A lot of people who knew me before, they were like, "Man, you're not really a corporate kind of guy. Like, it's not going to work well for you." And I actually enjoyed it. I enjoyed my time over Amazon. Some people grumble about it. I learned that the one thing I liked about Amazon the most is you really are your own dog. If you can reinvent yourself, you can do amazingly well over there, and they give you all the tools to do it. So if you had a problem with it, maybe you should look at yourself, because the opportunities were always there. They were, and I had 5 different roles over there. So why didn't I go back to big business? The main reason was that I wanted, because this had a specific area that I was very interested in that could be quite explosive. It was the right level where I could have the most impact and influence. That was the main driver. And it wasn't that I had anything against any large business, because I know a lot of people that work in those places, and they're fantastic, and I know their environments are fantastic. But in this case, it was the right scenario with the right technology at the right maturity, where I could really kind of dig my fingers in. And it's not that I can't do that at a big business, but my roots have been in more of the startup world, so it doesn't scare me as much. So you consider this, it's a bigger risk, but the potential of a bigger reward. And you get the opportunity to really control the destiny of a lot of it in a much more granular way, per se, than some of the places where you may in a large organization, because they have a structure in place that keeps things a little more risk adverse.
Cool. So we started by saying now metaverse is in a cold building. That was your analogy at the
Yeah,
moment.
it's in a winter right now. Let's just put it that way. You know, it's being built, but it's in a winter.
Right. So what would you, again, say Hadean is doing at the moment, and where do you see the future in another, let's say, 5 or 10 years?
So really, Hadean, one of the key parts of a metaverse is that you've got to be able to bring a lot of people together, and you have to be able to do that in a seamless manner. That's the thing that Hadean does really, really well. Their backend simulate is the core element that you're going to need no matter what. And so they've done that really well. And that is a core piece. Now, because they've also bridged working with like Unreal and other game engines, that means the partnerships are essential to it. So from my view, you know, what do I see? It's about building partnerships. It's about building ecosystems, working with companies, you know, obviously like Epic, Excelbyte, and, you know, others that have certain solutions that we are never going to build and don't want to build. And it's trying to work with them to make sure that we're also looking at the standards that are out there, so that we can move towards user-generated content, user-generated authoring, and being able to work with some of them in Web3, and work with some of them in NFT and some of the areas where it can be done correctly, where people don't get burned. You know, so this is, you know, within 5 years, it's being able to bring the ecosystem together so that we can start seeing a metaverse occur. And because Hadean has that kind of core underlying technology, which is only one piece of the equation, it's a lot easier to maneuver around, because people can take the Hadean stuff, they can put it on their servers in their environments and their architectures, where we are not trying to control the metaverse. We're like the Apache server for the back end. And the reality is that for every web server you've got, for every web page you have, you need a web server that's actually going to drive it. So you would consider that the Hadean stuff that we have here, the Hadean platform, is kind of like the 3D web server, to allow that spatial computing of where people are, what they're doing, and how they're doing it in large scale, and being able to jump from server to server in a meaningful way.
That's great. Thank you so much, Royal. This was really great. I learned a lot, and thank you for your service way back when. And
appreciate it.
Looking to see great things from Hadean in the future. And thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Incredibuilt. Development never stops.